All right. Hello and good afternoon, everybody. We are back live today for our second event and a four-part series that we have related to the intersection between brain injury and domestic violence. Last week, we welcomed our first speaker, Trish Smith, as she gave us an overview on this topic and shared some of her experience. In case you didn't catch us last week, my name is Danielle Hale, and I'm an occupational therapy student working with the Brain Injury Association of Virginia this summer. Thank you to everyone who joins us today. And if you are watching live, be sure to leave any questions you have in the comments under the video. That way our speaker can address some of those towards the end of the event today. So we do have another great speaker here with us today, and she's going to discuss some of the work that she's done related to brain injury and domestic violence. So in just a minute, you'll get to hear her talk about the research she's done on this topic, the framework and some of the materials that she helped develop, and also the findings from the U.S. Government Accountability Office report on brain injury and domestic violence. So everybody, this is Rachel Ramirez. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to start by just telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yes, well, hello everybody. It is so nice to see you. It is always, I have gotten much more used to talking into the great abyss, as I never quite know who's out there anymore because we've been doing so many things virtually. But I really appreciate, thank you to the Brain Injury Association of Virginia for having me. My name is Rachel and I am joining you from Columbus, Ohio. So if anybody's out there, OH, you're supposed to say IO. There we go. All right. So I am coming at you from Buckeye Country. So we are quite nervous about what this next few months are going to look like in our neck of the woods. So I hope everybody is healthy and safe and weathering the storm of COVID to the best of their abilities. I have 3 school-age children, so we are getting close to I don't know if D-Day is a good, who knows how this whole thing is going to go. So I hope that I feel like there are days where I'm very zen-y about this whole thing and it's going to be what it is. And then there are days where I'm like, oh my gosh, I just don't know what I'm going to do. So great to have you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that we've done in Ohio around brain injury. I will let you know that I come very much from the domestic violence side of things, a domestic violence perspective. I work with the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, have been with the statewide coalition on domestic violence. We have 72 member programs here in Ohio, and we do a lot of support, provide a lot of support for domestic violence services and programs. My very first job was in a domestic violence shelter in Tampa, Florida. And we had the opportunity in 2016, we got a grant it was actually a grant that was available for domestic violence programs that were more accessible to individuals with disabilities. So we actually ended up writing that grant around disabilities related to mental health and brain injury. One of the questions I get a lot as I've been doing more and more kind of national work and training around this was how did we decide brain injury? Why did we pick mental health? I think mental health, for those of you who work in domestic violence, and when we talk about particularly providing shelter services, it is something that we have always struggled with figuring out how to make our services work the best way possible for survivors who are struggling with kind of severe mental illness. Many domestic violence programs in shelters, lack little privacy. They're pretty chaotic, crazy places. And there's a lot going on. You have a lot of people who have all experienced trauma. Right now, again, we have COVID going on, all of those bigger picture pieces. So I think that there are ways in which we can absolutely improve access and improve services, though. One of the challenges when looking at disabilities related to mental health is, I don't know if we'll ever kind of get that one figured out and be like, oh, we can totally do this great with everyone. But then brain injury. Honestly, we didn't know anything about brain injury, hadn't ever provided training on brain injury. We had a colleague who was on it was actually a youth prevention, talking about kind of youth issues. And there was somebody there who was working on youth concussion stuff. And it made sense. We know that domestic violence victims have often been hit in the head. We know the very kind of first picture of a domestic violence victim was a person who had a black eye, right, which is head trauma. So, maybe this will be an opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about that. If any of you come in the nonprofit world, sorry, there's something hanging on my stairs in the back. Come from the nonprofit world. It was one of those grants that we didn't think we were going to get, I mean, we wrote a good grant, but we weren't hiring anybody. It's never hurts. You don't ever get any grants you don't write, but it wasn't like we had a whole project plan kind of figured out if we did. But we had done a lot of trauma informed work, ended up getting that grant. And I think very kind of quickly into the grant, one of the things that became that was very kind of impressionable on me was it didn't take me very long as I started to just kind of really think about brain injury in depth for the first time. It really took me about 3 minutes to be like, this is probably a thing. And I wonder how I have been doing this work so long and have been providing leadership and training on trauma informed care and domestic violence. And like, this has never even really crossed my mind. Like, how did we miss, like, how like, why is this not present anywhere? We were very, very lucky to be able to have a partnership with the Ohio State University, um, who was written in as an evaluator for our grant. But as we got into looking at the details, we realized we needed to go the research route. It was the first time a project we had ever, I'd been, like I said, been with my organization for a decade. A lot of times in the practice world, we don't really do research. We just kind of make stuff up. I'm not make stuff up, but we don't, like, it's not going through academic processes and institutional review board approval and all of that. It's not something that we had ever participated in. We actually didn't think we were going to need to do it at first, but our research partner convinced us that it was really important because we wanted to share some of our findings. And we were really, really lucky to have the support of someone who was able to kind of like help us plan out a process that would actually get us good information. So we started the project by a really, really good needs assessment, and went out and talked. We had 5 domestic violence agencies we were talking with, and we went out to all 5 of those agencies and talked with staff, did focus groups with staff, had groups with staff asking them questions about, what do you know about brain injury and mental health? What have you learned anything? Where did you learn things? What do you think, a brain injury looks like? Talk to me about an experience you had with a survivor who might have been struggling with a brain injury and it went well. Talk to me about a time when you were working with a survivor and it didn't go well. And one of the things that we learned very, very quickly was, we actually did ask similar questions about brain injury and mental health, but one of the things that we realized very quickly is hardly anybody had had any kind of training or education or had really known much about it. And then we talked to survivors, and we did interviews, very in-depth interviews with 49 survivors accessing different types of domestic violence services. About 60% of our sample access shelter services, but there are also people who were getting counseling services, who were providing who were getting legal advocacy, who weren't living in shelter. And we asked them about hits to the head, and experiences with strangulation, which is another very, very kind of different piece for those of you who might come from the brain injury world and don't work with domestic violence. Strangulation is probably not something you talk about very often or at all. It doesn't happen all that much outside of domestic violence, but it's an incredibly prominent and very devastating, very terrifying assault that many, many domestic violence victims experience. And when talking with survivors, over 8 and 10 of the survivors that we talked with had experiences with head trauma, had been hit in the head or choked or strangled, with the vast majority of them reporting that it had happened again and again. So we had that combined with talking to staff, and staff had, just like me, and I'm not trying to be kind of blaming or anything, but had no basic information about what a brain injury is or what it could possibly look like. So it was just like this real aha moment for us is, if we think about all the work for us, those of us in domestic violence have done around trauma informed approaches because we know trauma is so prevalent. Well, we learned that brain injury is incredibly prevalent, but we really need to increase the capacity of domestic violence programs. So we need to raise awareness around what it is, what it looks like, how it can impact your services, how to support survivors, how to help survivors make the connection between some of their struggles and brain injury. So this product was really around trying to kind of fill that gap between kind of general lack of awareness and knowledge among staff, and really, really, and I want not just staff, but among survivors. Very few survivors, in fact, I don't think any survivors that had ever kind of called the violence that was directed at their head, any of them had ever kind of made the connection that that could cause a brain injury. and kind of making that, kind of helping bridge that gap and increase that awareness.
Yeah, I think you make such a great point that people might not realize this intersection exists until someone brings it to their attention, and might not have understood that. It's a good point.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the other things that we also know that is true in domestic violence, and even talking with survivors themselves. We look at, there are a lot of brain injury symptoms that kind of overlap with symptoms of mental health, overlap with symptoms of trauma. So not only it is almost like we've had an alternate explanation for this for forever. And survivors who have said, like I was having a really hard time concentrating and focusing, but like, of course I was, because I'm in an abusive relationship or leaving an abusive relationship, and that's the trauma, and it's just really, really hard. Or my partner told me I was crazy, and now I'm feeling all crazy, and it must be that kind of piece. So I think it's almost more than like we've got this mysterious phenomenon and nobody knows what it is. It's like we have another explanation for this. So we've really never kind of thought about this and dug deep down into it. But I think that, what ended up happening is we have realized about this project the importance of starting to raise awareness about this, because what domestic violence survivors who have experienced head trauma think. They think a couple of things about themselves, and they're often treated this way by their symptoms. They think they're stupid, or they think they're crazy. And when we think about that, so sometimes again, they do reach out for help. They do go access services. They do go to the doctor. And sometimes that stuff, I mean, if you have, memory, and you all are much more the experts than we are, but if you have kind of some cognitive issues or memory loss related to brain injury, I don't think there's not too much therapy that's going to be able to kind of think about therapy for mental health that's going to help that get better. So then I might be accessing these services. And if I'm able to get into these services, then they're not effective. They're not really helping me. I'm still not getting any better. And I think that we see kind of like the domino effect about how then that can create additional health problems. So now I am even more depressed. Now I am using substances to cope. Now I am even more withdrawn because of some of the, the stuff related to how my senses have been impacted, and I can't go out, and I don't have any understanding of why that is. So I just think like there must be something super wrong with me, because who the heck can't go out and do things? And then we've talked with survivors who have, again, that's when they have attempted suicide. And I think that it's one of those things that we have found it to be very, very empowering, by helping people reframe and understand some of their struggles as like there's a reason for them. Just like one of the things that I use in training a lot is I say, like, if you break your leg, your leg's broken, right? You're not expecting to be able to run super fast and get upstairs and all of that kind of stuff. And we don't see someone with a broken leg and are like, why are they having so much problem getting in the door? Can't they just do that better? Like, they're injured and it doesn't work as well for a while, right? But that can happen to people's brains too. But then we can have these expectations within services. I mean, I will never forget when my first, job in a shelter, we had a survivor who would get lost coming back from shelter every single day. And like, she just like, we were all like, we don't know what's wrong with this lady, and she didn't know like who gets lost going to the same place every day. We didn't understand that. She didn't understand that. That might be something that you all who work in the brain injury world, like, that's not super surprising, right? A person with a brain injury can have problems with directions, right?
Right.
That's what we just were like. I mean, if you've never had a brain injury, like, of course. And I mean, there are people that are bad with directions, but like, we were in the same building every single day, and like, how long does it take you to figure out how to get home? But when we understand brain injury, that totally changes not only our understanding and our supports and how we can support her in that, but it changes how she or he or, whatever victim of domestic violence, how they think about themselves, understand what some of these challenges are, and understand what their own needs are in order to be able for them to live their daily lives.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And kind of going off of that, can you talk about some of the resources that you guys have created and ODV history?
Yes. So if you go to our website, and I don't know if I don't know how Facebook Live works, if we can put a link in that, or we can make sure we get it to you. On our website which is ODVN, which stands for the Ohio Domestic Violence Network.org. We have, I'm going to see if I might have some copies to show you. I'm sorry, I didn't think about this till right now. You're going to stay looking at me so you don't see me rifling through my super messy kitchen drawers, but I'm hoping I didn't move them. I do have them.
Perfect.
Right with the placemats. That's a good place to put them. I don't know why they're in there, but I knew where they were. So I'm just going to show you a few of these, and you'll be able to download them online. We have a couple of things that we developed. I have to have one of my cards. Well, I might not have one of my cards, but I'm going to show you this first. This is a booklet that we have called Invisible Injuries. And what this is, and you see it says when your head is hurt. It is just a booklet, and watch this. Let me see. Well, I am not going to try to flip around this camera because I think I'm supposed to be the host, but you will see there's information in here, if you look at this booklet, that is specifically written for domestic violence survivors to help them kind of better understand kind of what the impact of what is a brain injury, what the impact of brain injury is. What are some of the warning signs if you are hit in the head and it might be something that warrants medical attention. I know that it's very common for us to say, well, if you're hit in the head, you should immediately go to the hospital and get checked out. There are a lot of barriers that domestic violence victims have towards accessing medical services, including there are ways in which their partners literally won't let them go. Oh, I found my cards. Thank you. Won't let them go to the hospital. There are ways in which people don't have access to transportation. There's also just the reality, if I am a mother with children and was just strangled, I'm not leaving my kids at home. Even if I could go to the hospital. And again, there's lots of ways in which abusers prevent that from happening. So that's a longer book. And then I wanted to show you, this is another thing. This is a card that we developed that says, has your head been hurt? One of the things we were very intentional about was, it's got kind of a front and a back. Sorry. Was making sure with all of our materials, we actually didn't use the term brain injury anywhere. One of the things when we talked with the staff that we were working with, brain injury is a very kind of scary, people don't know what that means. And we're also not medical professionals in domestic violence. Brain injury is only diagnosed by a doctor, just like you wouldn't sit down with me with an intake and have me ask you a few questions and I would diagnose you with some mental health disorder. That's somebody who has that expertise that needs to do that. And we also were worried about that creating additional stress, additional strain, and wanted to start making the connection between head trauma and some of these behaviors and some of these challenges you have. So like I said in this card, it just kind of says on the top, has your head been hurt? And it talks about some of the things that can cause brain injuries, some of the physical problems, and some of the kind of cognitive and emotional challenges that there are. And it says, your head might have been hurt, and this might have something to do with it. We have information on the back that talks about danger signs. You will see there we have a whole section on choking and strangulation. One of the things we very intentionally did was we didn't develop kind of separate strangulation materials, like the strangulation brochure over here, the brain injury brochure over there, because when talking with survivors, most of the survivors we talked to had experienced both strangulation or some kind of violence that interfered with breathing, plus head injury. So they're not really, and often concurrently, even in the same violent incident. So we didn't really want to separate those out. And then we have one more booklet, but there's very specific strangulation materials that are talked about within the booklet. So, for example, I don't know how well you can see this, but we have a whole page right here that's right about strangulation. But again, within a larger booklet. Another kind of resource that we developed, this is a wellness journal called Just Breathe, and provides information around things like not just self-care, if people need help feeling safe, people need help with communal living, with coping with triggers, some people how to need help with a relaxing kind of, we have some information about how helping manage emotions. And then we also have, and I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of this tool that's developed online called Chats, which is a very kind of simple, basic, I'm sorry, I'm going upstairs, my kids just came home. Simple, basic kind of identification tool. We're trying to not call it loosely, because it doesn't really have a yes or no answer. Very loosely very loosely based off the HELPS tool, but specifically designed to include questions around strangulation and provide some guidance as to how to best accommodate the needs of survivors who are coming into services. That was really the goal of our project. We were really intentional that we don't think that the answer, and I'm sure that you know this, it would be nice if it was as simple with brain injury as, oh, if you might have had a brain injury, you go to the doctors and they figure it out and then you're good to go. Like, it's not strep throat. It's not the same thing. So we really were wanting to be very intentional that the responsibility, the goal of this project, and sometimes people do need to access medical care, but really the goal was thinking about how do we increase access to our own services. And if people are having problems with things like concentration or memory or executive functions or organizing things or physical problems that, we are accommodating those needs. We have programs that are doing things like providing sunglasses to people who are having problems with lights, changing the lighting, doing those kind of things. So it's really around, sometimes we do need to send people somewhere else, but we need to make sure our own programs and our own services are accessible, which sometimes they really aren't for domestic violence victims. So all of those materials are online at odvn.org, and I'll make sure y'all have my email address in case you want to follow up with me if you can't. We have a new website. So hopefully you'll be able to find them. But if for some reason you can't find them, you just let me know and I'll make sure to send you a new. We're still working out some of the kinks of that.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing all those resources and for sharing all the work that you guys are doing in Ohio. So now kind of more on the national level, I know that your work at ODVN was featured in the U.S. Government Accountability Office report in June of this year, 2020, and that's titled Improved Data Needed to Identify the Prevalence of Brain Injuries Among Victims. So can you kind of discuss the importance of this report and what exactly was found?
Well, and I think that so the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, actually came out to Ohio for 2 days at the beginning of their congressional investigation. Very, very exciting that someone in Congress, I did not know anything about the GAO and kind of what they are and how they work, but they can be mandated by Congress. They're really kind of like detectives or investigators, if that makes sense. And their job, they're not to kind of endorse any programs or strategies, or they're just kind of see like, well, what do we know about this issue? What people are doing, what kind of work around this issue, and what might need to happen next. They identified 12 projects, of which Ohio was one of them. I mean, think about that. They spent like 9 months writing this report. In the whole United States, they identified 12 projects in 12 different states. Virginia was one of them, which is one of the ways in which I got connected with this, because I was like, I got to meet all the people in all these projects. I knew a handful of them, but I didn't know anyone from Virginia. And I think a couple of the very interesting pieces out of that report is they said that, of those 12 projects, 8 projects had received some type of federal funding. But what was interesting about it, there was nobody, like our grant was a disabilities grant, right? And we wrote it around domestic violence and brain injury. There wasn't any type of funding to look at this intersection. So there were other grants that were designed for, again, more kind of general purposes, or people used brain injury money that could be dedicated to many different types of brain injuries, and decided to do domestic violence. But I think that what their recommendation that they came out with was just, the kind of the first step of any kind of new emerging project kind of problem, even if it is a problem. I think that that's the first step, is figuring out what is the magnitude or size of the problem. And we don't have any good data on like how many domestic violence victims experience head injuries. Kind of, we think about population-based data. So we have very, very consistent, very high levels of domestic violence victims with head injuries who access formal services. There have not been a lot of studies, but like I said, in our research is limited, of course. We don't talk to every single survivor in every single program, but many of those small studies that have been done have, 75, 80, 85% of survivors who access services. But we know that not all domestic violence survivors access services. So just like, again, when we think about the very first step to any kind of public health problem is kind of establishing a prevalence, or how big of a problem, how often this happens. We see that happening with, kind of every other kind of health problem. Like COVID is like, oh, does only, 5 people get COVID, or do 100,000 people get COVID? So that was really their recommendation. And there's not really a plan to figure that out. And there's like different, and this might be getting a little researchy on you, and I don't totally understand it, but there's different population-based surveys, that ask different questions in different ways. And some of them, a lot of them don't ask anything about head trauma. Some of them ask about TBI, but don't ask about strangulation. Some of them ask about strangulation, but don't ask about TBI. But there's not like, again, not a consistent way to figure out like, is partner inflicted brain injury a big problem or not? So that was really the recommendation that the Department of Health and Human Services, which provides lots of different type of funding, including a significant amount of funding for kind of domestic violence programs, establish a plan to collect that data. So then we know what type of resources need to be allocated to it. Again, it's kind of those kind of, like I said, the equivalent to if this happens to a lot of people and it creates a lot of problems, then we need to dedicate a lot of resources to kind of figuring out how to prevent it, how to intervene, how to address it. And it doesn't mean that if it, of course, every single person who's impacted by a brain injury, that's their story, and that's very important. But as you know, like if brain injuries happen to 1 out of every million person, that's very, very different than if brain injuries happen to 1 out of every, and I don't know what that number is. So I think it was exciting for a couple of reasons. It was exciting to have somebody who's in Congress interested in looking at this and learning about it. And also really, starting to think about kind of pushing and recommending the, Department of Health and Human Services to just kind of, and again, it's the very first step. It really is establish a plan to collect data. Then, once that, hopefully that plan will establish, then we have to figure out, kind of what that all looks like. But to really do that in a systematic way, and all of the kind of different people and different federal departments that are asking about different pieces of this, for them to kind of coordinate that work better. So it's a very, very exciting first step.
Yeah, exactly. I think, like you said, it's a great first step, but as we know, we can't talk about this intersection without talking about how much more research needs to be done. But having conversations like this is so great. We can start talking more about it and kind of getting the word out. So Rachel, thank you so much for joining us and speaking today and sharing more of the information and the work that you've done on this topic. I'm going to go ahead and put your email up on the screen now.
What are you putting on the screen? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Your email.
Okay, thank you. So please, like I said, go to our website, and our website again is ODVN, Ohio Domestic Violence Network, odvn.org. Please follow up with me. I hope that this was helpful. Thank you for being a part of my very first Facebook Live series. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to the Brain Injury Association of Virginia. We're looking forward to working with you all on kind of what some of these next steps are.
Yes, thank you again. And if you missed our first video with Trish Smith from last week, or if you want to rewatch today's video, you can do that by going to the videos tab on the BIAV Facebook page. And I also want to quickly note that we do have a change in our lineup for the last 2 speakers in this series. So next week, we're going to be having Dr. Kim Gorgons, and she'll be joining us on Wednesday, August 12th at 12 p.m. to discuss the impact of sex and gender on brain injury. And then the following week, Ann McDonald, who is our BIAV Executive Director, will be joining us on Tuesday, August 18th at 1 p.m. to discuss some different brain injury screening tools. So if you saw that event flyer that went out a few weeks ago, just make a note of those changes. But thank you again, Rachel. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we hope that you guys will join us next Wednesday.
TGIF, everybody. Take care. Stay safe. Wear your mask.
Bye.
Bye.